Bom dia a todos, obrigada pela presença de vocês. Meu nome é Thaís, eu sou do Grupo de Estudos em Agricultura Urbana aqui do IEA. E esse evento, então, faz parte do IEA e faz parte de um evento do Global Cities, aqui coordenado pelo professor Marcos Bucherit, que vai ser, eu também pertenço, que vai ser o debatedor de hoje. We have the pleasure to receive Professor Chris Williams. Professor Chris Williams teaches urban architecture and urban greening in Melbourne, University of Melbourne. He works in a beautiful campus called Berlin Campus in Melbourne, where he teaches all this. It's very beautiful. If you want to Melbourne, it's a visit worth. And Professor Chris and Professor Adrian are here because we have a sprint project together. It's a 2-year project with FAPESP, kind of where we know each other. They have 2 years to know each other's group, and then after this we have the possibility to apply for a larger project involving other researchers. So today now maybe it's a place where we could discuss further collaborations with other members of the university. So I have the pleasure to receive Professor Chris. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thais. I might speak without the microphone if everyone can hear me.
I think it's necessary.
Oh, okay. Sure. Okay. Thanks for telling me that. Thank you, Thais, and thank you everyone for coming. And I will say quite genuinely from the top, I apologise I speak no Portuguese. But I'm sure we can because obviously I have a particular accent, so if there's any difficulties, I'm sure we can translate during the discussion period. Okay, well, without any further ado, yes, I feel really privileged to come and talk to you about trees this morning, and trees are not necessarily my speciality, but I teach urban horticulture and tree management to undergraduate students, as we'll see in a minute. So I'm hoping to talk to you about the tree heritage of the city where I come from, which is Melbourne, Australia, to talk about the difference between public and private trees, to talk about and I think you'll find that I'm going to emphasise more than I even thought myself, the cultural and social issues that surround having a large urban forest, by which we mean simply the total inventory of trees in our city. And I do want to touch on operational issues, meaning the process of actually how you get trees to survive. Very superficially, because I think I'm talking for 45 minutes, I think, if that. Okay? Oh, wow, endless time, apparently. That could be dangerous. So you might have heard, or you may know that Melbourne has been voted the world's most livable city for 7 years in a row. And at some level that's very embarrassing. So as I say, I'm from Utopia and I'm here to help. I don't know, what's the Portuguese for utopia? Utopia, okay. So as you probably know, it means good place and no place in Greece, and so most of us who are born and bred in Melbourne particularly, and I'm one of those people, this is what we feel when we hear that our city is the world's most livable city. Because we have huge urban sprawl, we have infrastructure issues, we have some of the world's most expensive real estate. So it's almost a little bit embarrassing to be told that. So I come here genuinely, very humbly to talk to you about trees in our city and its heritage, and certainly not to tell you that you need to do what we do, that's for sure. All right. So just in case you don't know, that's Australia there, our big continent, roughly the size of Brazil. I think you're bigger. And Melbourne is a city in the south at 38 degrees latitude, which I believe is roughly the same as Buenos Aires and Santiago in Chile and Argentina, whereas you're right on the Tropic of Capricorn here in Sao Paulo. So Melbourne is a big sprawling city. It's about the same area as Sao Paulo, but it has only 4 million people, or 4.5, as opposed to your 20 million. So it's a very classically Anglo-Saxon sprawling suburban city with lots of private open space, lots of gardens. And it's very important to understand that to get a sense of why it is such a city so rich with trees. So just quickly, as they said, the main campus of the University of Melbourne is in a city suburb, or it's really in the city of Melbourne itself. It's at Parkville, and the campus that I teach at is called Burnley. which is on the banks of the Yarra River, which is the river that flows through Melbourne into Port Phillip Bay. So, yeah, so the significance of Burnley as a campus is that it was established in the late 19th century as a horticultural campus. So if you can imagine the colony of Victoria as it then was before Australia became a federation, this was a horticulturally obsessed colony. You have the combination of that sort of British sort of love of gardens and landscapes, at the time of European expansion, interest in botany and horticulture, and there was a very deliberate strategy to set up a college devoted entirely to growing and selecting trees and vegetation, not just for fruit production or for vegetable production, but also specifically for aesthetically based values. In other words, to make the city beautiful in its early days of its history. So in fact, last year we celebrated 125 years of continuous horticultural education, which is something of a world record apparently, believe it or not. So it's 9 hectares, it's very close to the city of the centre of the city, and I'll just quickly go through the main things that we teach. So nursery production, so growing plants, landscape design and construction, open space and park management, garden restoration, revegetation or ecological restoration, and arboriculture. And also, increasingly, we lump all those things together under the term green infrastructure. Two main qualifications, an associate degree, an undergraduate program in urban horticulture, and a master's degree in urban horticulture. Okay, so we do have fantastic historical images from this period, and what I want you to note is that you see the overseer there, who would be the me, that would be me 100 years ago, making sure that the students are working hard in the vegetable garden in our, what we still call the field station. But what I want you to note is the tree canopy in the background. So one of the things about Melbourne is it's at this very perfect latitude for growing everything. So we have, and roughly the good rainfall too, although getting drier with climate change. So we have the ability to grow very cold tolerant trees from a classically Europe or Western and Northern European climatic context, but also genuinely tropical trees as well. So it is quite unique in terms of the mix of trees that you can grow. And if you're really interested in trees, it's actually a city worth visiting for that mixture. So what you see there in that background is a canopy of trees that was established in the 1860s and 70s that is still there today. So that's a fairly bad image I took off Google Maps yesterday, but that's a roughly oblique aerial shot of that same tree canopy today. And what's fantastic about having these beautiful gardens where we teach is that we can have this mixture of flora, particularly the tree flora, that allows you to teach tree management and particularly tree selection, getting the species right where you actually are working and researching. Now, just very quickly, so the main focus of my own research and engagement is actually urban agriculture. And I run a program called the Burnley Novel Crops Project, which is exactly equivalent, as I discovered last year when I came here, to your punk movement, or punk. Punk or pank? Both. But you do say punk, like punk rock, so okay. So you were wrong, Petrus, about were you telling me to say pank? Anyway, I digress. So the idea of diversifying crop species is something I'm really interested in. And my interest in trees is really in around my teaching, where I have to teach undergraduates particularly which trees to select, the technical issues surrounding how we get more trees into our environment, how to establish them and how to grow them. The undergrads that I teach also have a subject which I don't coordinate called urban tree management. So I tell you all this just to emphasise that when you study urban horticulture at the University of Melbourne, there is this sort of focus amongst all the other things you can study on trees. Trees are just seen as absolutely fundamentally important to becoming a graduate. So I asked the question, and this is really what I want to lead into now, so where do they all go? If we make them think about trees a lot, where they meant to get jobs and do this strategic thinking and implementing trees. So really, and I know you have a similar situation here, I think, which I don't fully understand. So just to be absolutely clear, we call our whole metropolitan area Melbourne, but in fact, of course, that huge spread of the main central business district and suburbia is in fact divided up into these 29 local councils, which are referred to as cities. So its local government is responsible for managing the urban tree canopy or the urban forest, which often gets down to individual trees. So for example, just to give you a sense of the kind of investment that occurs around public open space, urban green space, green infrastructure and trees generally, this is from a few years ago now. This is the city of Yarra where our campus is based. It's an inner city council, and if you look there, you'll see that, for example, in the 2014 to 15 budget, there was roughly $4 million spent on libraries for a city of about 75 or 80,000 people. Arts and culture, 2.4 million. Sustainability and strategic transport, 4 million. It's quite a good budget, actually. But what I've highlighted is recreation and open space, which is 8.5 million. So recreation and open space includes sporting fields, parks and gardens, so literally children's playgrounds, looking after the rubbish bins, but also importantly, about 1.5 million of that is just tree management alone. Okay, so that's mostly this. And we might just stop and pause and sort of contemplate. Has anyone been to Australia? No? Well, I can say whatever I like. That's fantastic. Okay, so this image was taken by a colleague of mine who works for one of these big outer suburban, sprawling city of Hume, it's called. So this is a working class area, and much of his budget around trees is spent on the operational side. So we have this sort of suburban layout here. I'll have to stand and point. So mostly in English we call this the verge, right? But for some strange reason in Australia, we call that strip of grass the nature strip, right? I don't know if you can appreciate how what a strange term that is. But so nature strips in Melbourne, or the verge, are almost always planted with trees. Whether the trees are good or bad or well planted or the right kind of tree, that's another question. But a lot of money at the municipal level is spent employing trained arborists at various levels of education to maintain the trees. So that's a very common sight. Do you have the high vis culture now in Brazil? Everyone has to wear high vis. So we have lots of guys and girls in high vis working our streets, removing branches that are dangerous, planting new trees, and always chipping, endlessly chipping the wasted material. Which is, perhaps if we have time, we'll talk about what a valuable organic resource that is later. So that's where a lot of the money goes. It's a big expense for these 29 councils across Melbourne. But more importantly than just the obvious operational side, is that they're constantly thinking about what should be the right trees to grow, what kinds of trees, and what's the point of all this endless tree planting. Okay. Welcome. Hi. So, just quickly, I just want you to contemplate that our graduates, ideally, particularly at the master's level, we're hoping they'll work for the municipal level, go into local government, and be strategic thinkers about what we call urban landscape management. So, trying to juggle everything from... So they're trained in horticulture, urban horticulture we call it, but really their thinking has to be a lot more multidisciplinary and broader than that. So if you're, like my colleague who I got that photo from, if you're managing the urban tree canopy, managing trees, you're also worried about parks, the vegetation in the parks, the built assets in them. You're liaising with public health professionals about the positive benefits of parks, increasingly looking at urban agriculture. Should people be allowed to grow food in public spaces, for example? And the big bubble on the right, vegetation management, that's just one of the things that you have to think about. But you're trying to connect all those things together. So you might be thinking, well, yes, we plant trees in our verges and our nature strips and our parks. How does that actually relate to public health? So the strategic level of thinking. So what I want to do now is just kind of work through with you at the educational level how we at our university develop a narrative about the importance of having trees in urban environments. And I want to say right from the start that I guess we just assume that trees are positive. So as I was preparing this talk, I kept thinking, you know, it's the old story, when you leave your own culture, you suddenly think, oh, we're obsessed with trees. Why? You know, we just take it for granted that trees are just this thing that we have to continually grow. And so hopefully you'll find it interesting, some of the... Because it's not all positive. Lots of people don't like trees in Melbourne. Again, it's definitely not utopia. So this is just some of the slides that I would use with my students, for example. So in other words, obviously this is very basic for most of you, but it's always important to make, or to train, you know, people who are going to become professionals at the technical or at the strategic level, to remind them what a tree actually is. So the simplest definition in terms of looking at various life forms is, of course, to say, well, a tree is a large woody plant, often with a single trunk, that is greater than 6 metres in height. And it's actually a great relief to be here in the southern hemisphere, because this is one of these awful ecological succession diagrams that is completely biased towards the northern hemisphere, as many of you may know. But still, it allows you to say to students, well, we're not talking about the perfect North American meadow wildflower that's developing in a northern forest. We are talking about the end of the successional process, big trees, and that's a desirable thing for us to have in our urban landscapes. So again, I see this slide and I think, wow, this is only the positives of trees. What we're trying to say is that in a city like Melbourne, trees evoke powerful responses. Yes, mostly positive, sometimes negative. And what is that? We're trying to sort of defamiliarise their just everyday understanding of trees. And the thing that we emphasise is that, of course, trees are the largest organisms on the planet. At their best, they're huge, they're monumental, and they're always going to have this very, very powerful presence in a city. And that whether we recognise it or not, deep within our sort of cultural memory, or even arguably genetic memory, there is a response to trees. So it's never just going to be a simple technical functional issue to simply plant a tree. There will always be cultural and social emotions evoked by trees. And the fact of the matter is most people have a favourite tree, whether it's the species or a specimen. I'm very tempted to do that exercise with you now, but I'll wait till the end. I'll ask you all what your favourite tree is. So I chose, this is so again, Melbourne's latitude is 38 degrees south. This is an Australian rainforest tree, Ficus macrophylla, which I think I've seen growing in Sao Paulo. Is that true? A lot, yes. Yeah, in fact, yeah, that's right. I have seen quite a few of them. So I put this here because these are not indigenous to Melbourne. They start about 800 kilometres, maybe 1,000 kilometres away in New South Wales. But these were planted very early on in the city's history. There was various individuals in Melbourne, but a sort of general cultural feel for a kind of romantic vision of the jungle in colonial 19th century Melbourne. There were two schools of thought. Some people missed Europe. Oh, I want the spring and the lovely new foliage and this country's so evergreen. And others were like, no, yuck, Europe is cold and dark and horrible. Let's plant these beautiful jungle trees, right? And so they did. And so even though they're not indigenous to Melbourne, obviously indigenous to Australia, these trees are everywhere in the old parts of the city. And most people love them. So again, you know, this is a huge branch of a Moreton Bay fig. Just the way that trees frame spaces, create intimacy, or even evoke the sublime, even if they're a bit scary sometimes, they actually add to the urban environment in powerful ways. Now, I'm not going to go through these endless bullet points here, except just to, I think just to emphasise the third point that this is really a design kind of thinking here, that because trees just have such diversity of shapes and forms, they just obviously allow designers and managers to come up with all sorts of different ways to shape the urban environment from the ground through to the ultimate height of the tree. And one of the things that in our streets that people are always trying to achieve, even if residents don't necessarily want this, is this idea of the cathedral effect, which I'll show you in a second. Like creating tunnels of trees is just seen as an inherently good and powerful thing to create. And then there's the obvious functional criteria, which I'm not going to emphasise too much, only because it's taken as given, but the fact is that trees modify climate, particularly in terms of heat waves that we're increasingly having in Melbourne. Just the positive benefits of reducing noise, if planted correctly, pollution control, production of oxygen, carbon sequestration, habitat for fauna, children's play, just the checklist of things that we want from our urban forest, from our tree canopy. So again, coming here, thinking about this picture of autumn leaves in one of the parks in Melbourne, I thought, is this a universal thing that people would love? But we say to students, remember that when our deciduous, the European trees that we do have, when they shed their leaves in autumn, that when you create yellow dying leaves, that's enriching the urban environment. That's a good thing. So don't just think of trees in terms of carbon sequestration, ecosystem services, all the very functional things. Yes, they are absolutely the most powerful way perhaps to sell the agenda. But what people really love are experiences like kicking their feet through the leaves in autumn, right? That's something to always keep in mind as well. When I was a child in Melbourne in the 70s, people used to burn these leaves off. That was banned. But I actually kind of miss that memory, though. Yeah, so again, I don't want to labour the point, but just the power of deciduous trees, and just that little sort of carpet of yellow leaves in autumn, just the ability to create enriching experience for people by understanding what trees do, what their seasonal event is, what would be the consequence of someone enjoying this landscape because they now have this carpet of yellow leaves to enjoy. More colour. I don't know if you have this species in Sao Paulo. It would grow here. This is the famous lemon-scented gum. It's an Australian tree from Queensland. It has this very unusual branching structure and smooth bark, very popular in California. In fact, I think it's a weed there. Oops. But just making sure you have a diversity of tree types in the city. This is a extraordinary tree from New South Wales, related to eucalypts, not a eucalypt, but just, again, emphasising what you might call the inherent design features of trees when they're just unusual and even a bit surreal. And that's another Australian species. And then something as classic as an English oak, Quercus robur. So yeah, again, just to emphasise, Melbourne is a very strange place. You can grow everything from something that is sort of powerfully European to something that is literally from the Australian rainforest. Okay, so now I'm going to delve into some more of the cultural issues now, just to, again, to emphasise how, although we have this very positive agenda around trees in Melbourne, that we have about 160, 70-year-old history now as a city, and the popularity of trees has waxed and waned. It's now back on the agenda in a very big way. I won't go into great detail about this novel that was written in the 1960s about a guy's childhood in Melbourne. But what I think is interesting, though, is that this book is not about trees or even about gardens, but it has passages where it discusses the main protagonist's relationship to different gardens in the city. So he looks at working class gardens, he looks at a very old upper middle class garden, and he also looks at a new garden where he's just been recently married. And what you see there is that the old garden that he knows from the 1890s has huge big old trees, and he loves it. He thinks it's really kind of established and secure and intimate. And then when he gets married, he goes to a suburban estate where there are no trees, just flowers. And then as an act of rebellion, he plants a tree right in the middle of his front garden, and it's a big eucalyptus, a native tree. It takes over, starts destroying the neighbour's flower beds, and he ends up getting divorced. So it's this interesting idea that a tree planting can be controversial even in a marriage. But there's a very serious point to this. We had a famous architect called Robin Boyd, who was a modernist, and he wrote a book in 1960 called The Australian Ugliness, which is actually a really interesting book to read in terms of the kind of relationship of colonial country like Australia to sort of international design movements like modernism. Anyway, he realised that in the colonial period that people had loved trees, and then he decided in the 1950s that Australia had developed agoraphobia, meaning a fear of trees. And so, yes, he refers to this nature strip, and he says, so this is writing in 1960, it's very different now again. He says that trees are often planted in the streets on the nature strip, as the 6 feet wide lawn between footpath and trafficway is called. Plain trees are popular, but after each season, when they sprout, hopefully, the shoots are pollarded back again to the knuckles by diligent council employees, and the trees become grotesque, arthritic knots of wood. So there was a period, or a few decades, where we had a very negative view of trees in our city, despite having this heritage of big trees. And that's a London plane tree there. So what they used to do was that during this period after the Second World War, they would simply come along. Every time the tree grew, they would come back and chop it back, because everyone was extremely afraid of big trees, and some people are still like that in Melbourne. All right, how am I going for time, please? It's all good? Yep. So what I want to do just quickly now is just explain to you how the difference in the sort of tree form across different suburbs. So this is a wealthy part of Melbourne, about 10 kilometres from the main centre, and you can see there's a big park there which is called Central Park, nothing to do with New York. It has a recreational oval and a big park, and you can see the lines of streets there all have these large canopies, excuse me, these avenues of trees. And so I mentioned earlier the idea of the cathedral effect. So this idea that you should live in a tunnel of trees is just seen as a kind of desirable feature of the urban landscape. And I have seen some avenues like that here in Sao Paulo too. That's kind of the benchmark, that's the goal, even if not all the residents like it. And so there's a difference between the kind of professional view that we're teaching, which is that this is a desirable thing aesthetically in terms of cooling streets, versus the fact that some people living here might think that these trees actually have invasive roots, for example, going into their gardens. But this is seen as the kind of ideal, whatever species you're using. And again, this emphasis on seasonal events. So the fall of the leaves is seen as actually something of high aesthetic value. So this is a 1950s suburb which you could argue was built during that period of agoraphobia, fear of trees. So you don't have, and just to show you the contrast. So you can see that in a post-war suburb there were fewer trees in the gardens. These are very large areas. So the house blocks here are about 600 to 800 metres squared just for one family. So a large area of land. It's fantastic for urban agriculture. If you want to grow food here, it's perfect. Look out for the trees actually do get in the way, I have to admit. But yeah, you can see that the emphasis on tree planting has dropped off after the Second World War. So you have a period of decades where, sure, there are plenty of trees there, but nothing compared to the early suburbs, and particularly the wealthy suburbs. So here's on the street level here. So the trained landscape professionals in Melbourne, the arborists, those who have taken on this agenda of tree planting, look at this, I look at this, and I see this huge area of land, this verge or nature strip, and I think, well, the trees are way too small. The ecosystem services, if you like, of these small trees is not high. So again, the working assumption we're making is that where you have the volume for roots, where you have the space, the trees should be huge. So again, it's just a premise of our work is that the goal is to get big trees into the landscape. So that's not performing that street. This is the same area, and that's getting better. So you have much larger trees on only one side of the street, and the reason they don't have trees on the other side is because they decided that the trees would grow into the power lines and that would create a problem. So it spoils the aesthetic value of the cathedral effect, if you like, but at least there are big trees there. So what I want to sort of talk about now is just how we're dealing with the balance between the legacy of having large trees in our city, the period where people lost interest in trees, and now the revival of interest in trees, the fact that we're really setting across the different municipalities the idea that everybody should have, or that parks and streets should have as many trees as possible, and usually big trees. So the big problem is that we have lots of big trees that are now very old and they have to be replaced. They're going to start to get old and die. And of course climate change adds to that an extra level of analysis that you need to do, because climate change, increased temperatures, particularly in summer, will likely kill certain species of tree. So the actual city of Melbourne, which is the area of the central business district, has produced an urban forest strategy that is regarded, or they tell us, they've won international awards, as a kind of international benchmark strategy for urban trees. And so, the document actually says we have 60,000 trees that we are responsible for as a council, and they've been valued at $650 million. So the campus where I work at about 20 years ago developed a valuation system so you can actually price a tree. And this is used, it's called the Burnley valuation method for those of you who are interested, and it's actually used as an operational document quite often by councils when they're dealing with developers. So if someone wants to build a new building in the city and they have to remove a tree to do it, they may have to compensate the council for, let's say, $100,000 for removing the tree. So they put the price on the tree, and by and large this is quite strongly enforced, particularly in the actual city of Melbourne itself. But usually some sort of offsetting process occurs, and particularly now where a tree has environmental or direct habitat value, developers will actually have to pay the valued price if they want to kill the tree, even if they're going to replant it. Yes, so the propaganda is there. We live in the world's most livable city, and our parks, gardens, green spaces and tree-lined streets contribute enormously to this status. So just the bottom sentence is important. So they're saying here in their strategy, we expect to lose 27% of our current tree population in the next decade and 44% in the next 20 years. So it's a fairly frightening scenario, and they're taking it very, very seriously. So what they want to do is increase the canopy cover from 22% to 40% by 2040. And then the thing that's been very interesting as a strategy, this has had a big impact on other councils in Melbourne, but even across Australia, is their idea of really starting to analyse risk management of how you select different trees. So they're saying we want to have no more than 5% of one tree species, no more than 10% of one genus, and no more than 20% of any one family. That's partly because, as you have in Brazil or South America generally, and Australia, we share this big family, the Myrtaceae, the myrtle family. And so, as you probably know, a very large genus in Australia is eucalyptus in the Myrtaceae, and we're so reliant on trees in that family that if, for example, the myrtle rust, which I think comes from Argentina, myrtle rust. Who's the tree expert? Anyway, myrtle rust. Anyway, you have to plan for myrtle rust. Yeah. Yeah. So that's in Australia now, but it doesn't seem to affect eucalyptus as much as other species. But the point is trying to plan for catastrophic diseases or effects of climate change. So this is very unusual, this is new, very novel, the idea of actually saying that we should spread the type of species we use across a diversity of families and genera. This study here, The Future Urban Forest, this is a recent work by a colleague of mine, Dave Kendall, who's looked at the types of trees that would survive in Melbourne under different climate models. So if the temperature increases in the next 50 years by 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, what types of species will perform better in terms of drought, increased winter temperatures, summer heat waves, and so on. That's a very interesting document, and that's available online. So this is literally a slide that we use. Again, I realise we're very preachy about trees. So we tell students, get out there, plant as many trees as possible. Because when you plant a tree, and you do it well, you get the right species, you establish it well, your legacy will last way beyond your individual lifetime. Do you have this expression in Portuguese, why can't we have nice things? Does that, your mother say that to you when you break things when you're a kid? My mum did. This is why we can't have nice things. So, actually, I just went past a magnificent car park here in the university that is a shade-lined car park. So I've got to get a photo of that before I leave. So look, the idea is that's bad, just universally condemned, and that's better. That's Australia, and that's actually from America. But that's the ideal. So in other words, just being very positive about saying to potential graduates, you can get out there and modify the most unpleasant aspects of our urban environment. So I just wanted to finish off on, as I said from the start, just some of the more, because this is a whole subject on the operational aspects of establishing trees, not just the strategic thinking. And that is the reality of who grows them, how do you make sure they actually survive, because a lot of tree planting is done very badly. And so, anyway, I have to give credit to the North Americans here. In the United States, there have been decades and decades of research on how do you grow trees really well in nurseries so that when they get into the landscape, they actually survive. Research on how do you dig a hole properly. It does sound funny, but making my students go and dig the perfect tree hole is actually a very fun exercise. In fact, do I have a picture of a... No, I don't. I was going to put in a picture of digging a hole of an actual perfect wok-shaped hole. For those of you who don't know, you should create a wok-shaped hole, not a giant pit. Let's go and do one afterwards. We'll go and dig a hole. Anyway. Okay, so again, just quickly, the physiological issues around tree planting. So what, this could be one of many slides that I could show you, but this is relevant, I think, to our discussion here this morning, just because what's important to emphasise is that we emphasise that on this bottom point highlighted that urban soils are often radically altered, structural damage and compaction. So, because one of the issues is, if these giant cities we've created all over the globe are our future as a species, and if we want more trees and more vegetation generally, to be honest, but let's focus on trees obviously today, then we have to face the facts that the indigenous soils themselves have been radically altered, chemically, structurally. They've had the air squashed out of them. And of course you can spend a lot of money modifying, ameliorating soils and trying to bring back the microbial life and all that stuff and decompact them, and that's the ultimate goal. But sometimes there are many species that just simply, indigenous species that have evolved there that will no longer grow in those environments. So you have to be very realistic about the kind of physiology of the trees you're selecting the species. So quite often it's trees or species that come from seasonally waterlogged environments that can tolerate low soil oxygen that are usually very powerfully, are fantastic urban trees. Now it does mean you face that issue of a narrow palette of trees, and that is an issue. So, I mean, you don't need to worry about the species here, but just to say that we try to help students understand that in those situations where you have a very tight budget, where you can't, quote unquote, restore the soil, then you are going to be limited to those species that have that tolerance. Is that a universally ugly picture? It is? Oh, that's good, right. I'm sort of worried about the cultural relativity here today. So that's an Australian species of Melaleuca, which are extremely drought tolerant, extremely tolerant of compaction, low soil oxygen. Interestingly, they They're very much a post-war safe tree. In the 19th century, our colonial ancestors in Melbourne would have planted a giant tree there. Because they were into big trees. But after the Second World War, it's like, oh no, it has to be small. So this is what happens if you get the conflict between the people providing cable television and the councils maintaining the trees. And again, here this is a winter scene. The species here doesn't look particularly perhaps attractive at this time of year, but it's an American oak that grows in swampy conditions, very good as an urban tree. And to the left, you can see where the power lines, it's a tree with apical dominance, and it's just been, tabular branching structure, and it's just been chopped in half. This is a wealthy area. I mean, if people don't know that the tree looks ugly, or maybe it doesn't matter, I don't know. Ignorance is bliss. So I just put, this is just a slide, this is actually an industrial area in Melbourne. Again, wherever the council, even though it's an area where not many people come on weekends, it's not a residential area, still the idea is to get trees into the environment. So the process of planting, mulching, the plastic water ring there, the berm, so that when the council workers come along and fill it up, the tree will actually grow and then become self-sufficient. The fact that the stakes there, staking trees, as research has shown, is actually unnecessary if the tree is healthy. So that staking is kind of symbolic, literally. What research has shown that when you stake trees, there's a perception that it's being cared for and then people won't vandalise it. Extraordinary, isn't it? This is my last slide. I just wanted to, I suppose, emphasise that having a really good nursery industry is extremely important. Melbourne's lucky it has a legacy of plant nurseries that goes right back to the early days of the colony, and there was a big nursery in Melbourne established by a Swedish man that actually became a major exporter to the United States. So it has we have a legacy of tree growing at the propagation side. Now this nursery here, called Metro Trees, was started by a man called John Fitzgibbon, and he was a Burnley graduate who was a true believer. Get more trees in the environment. He took a financial risk to set up a nursery that would specialise in growing trees for public landscapes, for local councils, perfectly grown pot technology, and for many years he did okay, but not many, he wasn't a thriving business. And all of a sudden, the City of Melbourne's urban forest strategy has so increased the awareness of other councils in Melbourne of the need to have good quality trees and to increase the canopy and to increase the total urban forest, that his business has now boomed. So he's had to move from his old site to a new site in the hills east of Melbourne, and so he's, I guess it's an example of how when one local government really commits very seriously to analysing the need for trees, what kind of trees we're going to grow, how they're going to be grown in terms of the risk of climate change, it can have a flow-on effect to business as well. That trees become an industry in their own right. So, I mean, you can't do a presentation these days without talking about the economics and business, can you? So that's why I thought I'd end with that slide. I think that's it. Yes, it is. So thank you. Sorry, I just said my students would have groaned if they knew I'd even mentioned that novel, My Brother Jack, but a very, very vague cultural reference. Okay, thank you.
Antes de começar, tinha esquecido de dar uma mensagem. O Dr. Roberto, do Instituto Botânico, está aqui e ele quer convidar todo mundo para um congresso que vai ter, né, Dr. Roberto? Se eu puder falar. Desculpa, Dr. Luiz Barreto.
Uma satisfação estar aqui. Queria convidá-los para o 7º Simpósio de Restauração Ecológica, que ocorrerá no Instituto de Botânica. Esse é o 7º simpósio, como eu lhe falei, Não sei se vocês pegaram os folders que deixamos na frente, mas não há para todos, né? Apenas uma pequena observação. O simpósio irá do dia 6 ao dia 10 de novembro. Hoje estão ocorrendo os minicursos. A abertura do simpósio, na verdade, ocorrerá no dia 8 e é composto de 4 mesas. A primeira mesa diz respeito à sustentabilidade e economia nas florestas e nas áreas a serem restauradas. A mesa número 2, aos avanços na restauração ecológica de florestas secas. Na mesa 3, avanços na restauração de florestas úmidas. E na mesa 4, as novas tecnologias e difusão do conhecimento. Espero encontrar vocês lá, serão muito bem-vindos. Ocorrerá no Centro de Exposições Imigrantes, ali do lado da rodovia Imigrantes, com amplas acomodações, com salas totalmente aparelhadas para uma ótima recepção a todos. Muito obrigado, bom dia, muito obrigado pelo convite.
Obrigada, doutor Barreto. Marcos.
You called me to debate, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Would like to say that the Botanical Garden, I worked at the Botanical Garden for 20 years, and I was one of helping to organize the first meeting on this restoration of forests. This has a long tradition, and the urban forests, we're not talking very much about urban forests in this. You didn't talk a lot about that. You can comment later on.
Sure. It's a confusing term. Sorry, I apologise if that the term urban forest. We do have, as the gentleman's talking about, urban forests in Melbourne, and we have a big restoration agenda as well. But the city of Melbourne itself has decided to coin the term urban forest just to capture something. It's almost like a communications term. So that's probably quite confusing. But it does mean the total inventory of trees, just so we take the individual trees seriously as well, not just the actual creation of individual forests.
Just for you to know, here we are truly surrounded by forests in São Paulo. Real forests. Some people are trying to coin the concept of urban forests inside the city, but this is not really the definition of forest. Forest, we mean you have a large area with biodiversity still working, ecosystems is still working. It's not an artificial system inside the city.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
In the sense that I think, like I say, that term, the way we use it now, only in the last 2 years, can be quite confusing. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Professor Saldiva.
Unfortunately, I have to go but on behalf of the Institute of Advanced Sciences Studies, yes, I misspelled the institute that I direct. So, can you imagine how poor is this institute? Even the director doesn't know the proper name. But I think that this is a very, it's typical. This is a topic that fits perfectly well in the scope of advanced studies in terms of complexity, because, as you mentioned, the green areas inside urban spaces encompasses a lot of topics such as culture, biology, climate, economics, and I would reinforce the role of health effects. There are some evidences that we have receptors for beauty in our body, so we can modify gene expression and modify the expression of interleukins, the levels of cortisol, and also the increased immunity when exposed to green areas. So this is the reason why hospitals are being greener and greener, not only because of aesthetical values, but because of evidence, strong evidence that people do better in hospitals when the hospitals are green. So I think that, in my opinion, with the bias of a physician, I think green areas inside urban spaces belong to two big domains: health and human rights. So the rights of using the city the cities in their entirety. So it's a pity that I should leave, but I'm very thankful for your presence and for conducting such a discussion in this institute. Marcus is a botanist and is involved in, as a symbolic value, he is a botanist and conducts the Global Cities project inside this institute. And Thais Mawad, the fearful Professor Mawad, has this reputation here precedes its arrival. She's a pathologist and physician as well. So it's important to adding other areas. I think social psychology, anthropology, and other areas are badly needed when we envisage to include plants in areas where human beings live. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obrigada, professor Saldiva, pela sua presença.
Thank you, Professor Saldiva. I'll send you a report. I don't know whether this is the one you were talking about, but I just received a report from Australia, actually, that they did a study in the hospitals there, and the people are 1.5 times. They live earlier 1.5 times than the people that are in a hospital that doesn't have trees. Yeah.
Not only in the hospitals, but for instance, living close to a park reduces the risk of cardiovascular mortality into 30%. This is more than beta blockers and statins. So I think this perhaps can add value to a single tree.
Absolutely. So again, that's why the City of Melbourne prefers the term urban forest, because it wants to spread the idea that the more trees you plant, obviously the canopies will fuse across the city. So in fact, to be fair to them, the term forest is actually accurate.
The term that the doctors make, for example, over a weekend in Portuguese is called plantação. It means a big plant. He was joking about. So just to start the debate, looking at your presentation, thank you very much. That was really fantastic, and it's nice to hear from Utopia. And unfortunately, I have never been there. I have even family there, but I have never been there. And from what I saw here, and I'll throw up some things for the people here to discuss as well. In São Paulo, we have half of what you have there. You have 4 million people, right? 60,000 trees are under the responsibility of
that one small.
That's the one small. That's not the 4 million. Okay.
No.
So it's much higher than us. Here we have only 650,000 trees in the whole city, and they are very much concentrated in the region. in this region where you are. So this region may look like utopia, and I think it looks like utopia for people that are outside of, of the region, and this makes a very big difference. So we have this mixture of Africa, Australia, whatever you want to see in São Paulo, you are going to see, right?
Yes.
And also regarding trees, we have a large amount of species that from different places in the world, including many eucalyptus.
Yes, I've seen them.
Eucalyptus grows very, very well, and we use that for paper, as you know, and but also they planted this in the city. And we also have in common the British tradition, because these trees that we have, especially the Tipuana tipu, that is one of the main species that we have in town, this all started with a British company.
Right.
And they made all the architecture and urbanism in these main quarters that arrive up to here. If we open here, we can see a little bit of that. So the tradition also started with the British, and then was sort of lost. But the trees, our trees may be now 60 years old. I would also ask you later on to comment a little bit more on how you treat the trees, because we don't treat the trees. I work with tree longevity, is one of the lines of research I work, and my guess, we are trying to discover, my guess is that one of these tipuanas that we have here could easily live 150 years, but it only lives 60 years because we don't treat them.
Right.
And we don't treat them because there is a clash, and this is another thing that I would like you to comment, between the biology of trees and the law. Right? There are laws that forbid people to treat trees because we cannot give any remedy, any substance to a tree, because this could cause problems to the persons that are moving around the city, and then the council here doesn't do that because they are afraid to be prosecuted. If somebody has a problem or die, and it's suspected that this is related to the substance that is put there. So I'm also glad that you used the word kill instead of tear the tree or any other term. We don't use this term here. I use this term. So it's matar. When trees are living beings, right? As you well said, one of the biggest or the biggest organisms that we have on Earth, and the organisms that 80% of the carbon on land, is on trees in the whole planet. So we are here, and the climate is stable because of them.
Absolutely.
So but we don't show any respect to trees as living beings. We are trying to do that now here. I think that São Paulo woke up for trees from a few years ago. There are some people that started earlier, but we are really now trying to understand where are our trees. We still need a lot of science. We don't know anything about them, like, for example, how much they are going to live, and if they are treated, or what is the rate of photosynthesis, how much water they produce, and what are the diseases, because if we knew the diseases, we could work on planning to avoid the diseases to attack. And now there is a wave. I don't know if you have any experience on that, and I think there are many people here that are that think that this is a good way to go. Of taking, I call this tree xenophobia. Sure. It's the people dislike the foreign trees here. They want to take all of them out and put only trees from our biodiversity. This could, in my opinion, cause a big problem in the future, because we don't know what kind of trees we are planting. and they may have diseases that we don't know. They may have roots that are very aggressive, and we don't know anything about that. So everything is happening now in this way here. In a way, it's very similar to what you have there. Yeah. Right? Climate change is not yet, I don't know about the Australians, that's my third question. Sure. If the Australians have the conscience really of what's the importance, and this is really utopia, because you are already there, the importance that trees will have when we cross in 2030 the average of 1.5 degrees. If we cross that, there are data showing that if you have, and we even medicine people brought this New York guy to talk, I don't remember his name, about the shadows in the city, right? If you have a long row of days with the night very warm, then people start to die really very quickly. And we need these shadows, but people don't realize that. I think here people don't even know what the IPCC is. I don't know whether in Australia you have the same problem of conscience, because we have to try to link everything.
In Australia, as you may know, we have, with the eucalyptus forest, we have very dangerous, intense bushfires that when they're catastrophic can kill hundreds of people. And yet in 2009, when we had raging fires around the city that killed 147 people, it was tragic. The reality is the same month we had 3 or 4 degrees over 44 degrees Celsius. That killed more people than the bushfire. Yeah, it was 43, 44 degrees Celsius for 3 or 4 days in a row. That killed 300 or 400 people, but didn't get the publicity. In fact, it was barely covered, compared to obviously what is a really horrific and tragic, bushfires when they take off are extremely frightening. So in fact, it is the heat waves that are more damaging to public health than in the risk of bushfire, for example. But yes, it's a very simple agenda that I've really tried to lay out, which is that if we accept the climate models, and a municipality like the city of Melbourne now influencing the other cities in the wider city is saying we need, and maybe there'll be areas where we make mistakes, but overall we need a greater urban forest, a bigger canopy, simply for the shade value, as you say. Just accept that as a working premise of what we do.
You count tree mortality as well when you have these heat waves, or how do you deal with the trees? When do you do euthanasia, for example? Do you know enough of the trees to plan precisely when a tree should be taken?
So it's a very interesting question, and I think when you think, I've read papers that say there are about 35,000 plant species that humans use across the planet, including food, fibre and ornament, out of the 300,000 plant species on the planet, give or take 20, 30,000 species. So nobody, even in Melbourne, has the money to quantify some of these biological issues, right? So what we really depend on by having horticulture graduates and applied botanists is using cities like Melbourne and old cities like Sao Paulo as giant exercises in qualitative analysis, meaning if you know you have trees or plants generally that have been planted in urban contexts for 50, 100, 150 years, and you have some parameters like soil maps, for example, or good climate data, you can start at least doing a qualitative analysis of how they perform in an urban environment. So, for example, we have a very big nursery industry. It's very old, and I know it's almost like ethnographic level analysis. But you say, okay, generally speaking, if you go, what's our experience of how long this species lives in a sandy soil in the southeast of the city? Oh, you find out that the records show that they live for 60, 70, or 100 years, or in a different soil type, they live longer. In other words, it's a question of tapping into the historical records and even at the sort of almost at the focal popular level, at least trying to analyse some of these issues, because you'll never have the money to do you won't be able to do the quantitative research for every single species. So you need trained professionals out there who can at least build up databases, for example. So we have one that we're very reliant on. So the tolerance information, so is it drought tolerant, is it cold tolerant, heat tolerant, is 90% of the time based on, let's be honest, driving around, making observations, working with other professionals. I think that's very important to get that culture established. And then gradually you can narrow it down to almost like triangulate to relatively accurate information.
How big would you say is the science, tree science task force that you have behind all that? You said in your presentation that this was really important in the past, but nowadays, I'm telling you that because I have been defending here for a few years already that São Paulo should have an institute only on trees, run by the council, collecting this data and doing research on trees. Do you have that?
So we have our School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences has people doing this work. So we have the foresters still looking at the timber value of particular trees, who then work with the urban specialists to look at some individual trees at a quantitative experimental level. But then arboriculture itself, very influenced by the Americans, is huge. In other words, so trying to combine the management of the trees by the people who literally climb them and use chainsaws and all that stuff with the tools that come from the scientists, like the diagnostics of diseases, for example. So having the equipment that allows you to say, this tree looks healthy, but in fact has been attacked by a fungus or some other disease. So in other words, it's the major effort now is to marry up or to join up that operational people wearing the high-vis jackets, right, and the hard hats, with the tools developed by science to help them diagnose problems at a real level, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that exists. Yeah.
Agora abre para a plateia, pode ser em inglês direto, ou se quiserem fazer as perguntas em português, a gente ajuda a traduzir, tá? Quem tem questões? Sérgio Reis.
Morning. So, what he mentioned is São Paulo is about 15% with reasonable greenery, and the other 85%, which is about 17 million people, essentially with no trees on their daily lives. And that's, I think, is the main problem we have to solve. What do you have to say about that?
That's a big job you're giving me. Yeah, that's right. No, I think, and just from Professor's comments as he left, I mean, I think I do want to emphasise that a couple of things, and I will get to your point very quickly, is that in the poorer parts of Melbourne, in the socio-economically deprived areas where the tree agenda is rolling out, there is an assumption there that trees are good for people, even if sometimes communities don't actually like trees. So I think it's an interesting point that even if you can prove that someone's there are fewer heart attacks if you live near trees, it doesn't mean that people like trees. Now I love trees, and I have to keep reminding myself that not everyone wants a giant tree shading them. And there is research on this. It's very interesting. So having said that, when I see these areas anywhere in the world that are completely devoid of trees, I can't help thinking, wow, this needs working on. You need to start the agenda as quickly as possible. And then so the point is, if you really were to make those links between the hard evidence of human health and quality of life and the presence of vegetation, particularly trees, then it would seem to me to be a matter of standard policy that you would start working towards that. Right? I mean, that's very easy for me to say coming from other side of the Pacific Ocean, but the way I'm answering your question is it would seem that would be an alarming situation, and someone should start to invest in the policy and the programs to change that. Even though, obviously, it's going to be a long, decades-long process of dealing with choosing the plants, bringing the, getting the investment right, the educational infrastructure, bringing the community along with you, making sure people want these trees, all that stuff. But as a matter of policy, it would seem to me, it would seem relatively urgent to me.
Good morning. I think you had a wonderful presentation here because we are in the pressing issue of how we can change the environment in a city like São Paulo. And trees are the most, I think, cheaper, effective, and most easy to deal with in the city of natural technology that can give a lot of benefits for the city. So it's very easy to try to think that city can be transformed by trees. I think that it's the main issue you should be discussing today. But anyway, you show in your slides one of the cover, the amount of cover of the canopy of the city. The canopy of the city is around 40% that you're dealing with the goal in your
target,
city.
yeah.
Because in other examples, you have around 30, I don't know, how do you reach this 40% of canopy to achieve? And then another question. You said that you want to use a very diversity of plants, of species. You say that don't use no more than 5.
Of one species,
One species, and so the genus and family of sets. But how do you can achieve for the view of the management of that? Because every different species has a different treatment. So how you can do that with millions of trees in city if you have so specialized teams to have to prune that tree that time of the year and the other another time? So how do you can manage in a kind of forest? Because we're dealing with a forest, of course. We're dealing in a way that agronomical engineer is dealing with civil culture, how to say call that. It's artificial forest and have to be managed as an artificial forest. So how do you deal with this high diversity in a practical way, everyday basis?
Yeah, so they're great questions. So the first point about the canopy target is developed, remembering this is just the one, that strategy is just the main central business district part of the entire metropolitan area. That's their target. But as I said, they've influenced now the other councils in that area too. So people are developing these targets. So they developed it based on an assessment of realistic planting zones, so where you could physically put in a tree, and by targeting the streets where they did the most analysis of temperatures of unshaded streets. In other words, where you had evidence that on some days you had trees without streets were heading into the high 40s and even a couple of times over 50 degrees Celsius in terms of reflected heat. So they said they prioritised areas that needed trees. And I said I was going to talk about private trees, but I really didn't, because I was really talking about the public urban forest, because we also have large amounts of private open space where most councils have quite strong regulations about what you can actually do in your own. You can't actually just go and take a tree down in your own garden up to a certain height or beyond a certain height. And one of my brothers is actually a council officer who actually approves or disapproves the removal of trees. That's relevant to your question because, in fact, when you select a diversity of trees and you commit, you've already committed to the benefits. You select the trees and you then commit to the program, and you simply have to commit to the level of investment required, which means that you have to have universities or technical colleges that produce the graduates that understand the requirements of the individual trees, understand a plant selection process. You know, is it appropriate to plant something that is locally indigenous here, or is in fact something more appropriate from a design point of view to come from elsewhere on the continent of Australia, or should it be from Europe or North America or China because of functional issues? all that knowledge has to be assumed to be in trained professionals and to have the level of investment required to make that work. Now, one point that relates to what you were saying, Marcos, is that one of the, again, the working assumptions of all that is that you are selecting species that are low input, so they're sustainable. So you are already trying to screen trees that are known to be low, to not suffer from pests and diseases where possible. So we have one tree in Melbourne where we do invest a lot of money in that sort of remediation. That's because we have the world's largest population of Dutch elms. So it's this very unusual situation that the elms in Europe have been wiped out by Dutch elm disease. In New Zealand and Australia we don't have that. So if you want to come and enjoy these beautiful English and Dutch elms, you go to Melbourne, not England. And we do spend a lot of money killing the vector insects that may spread this disease. So, yeah.
Next comment there.
Hi, my name is Mariana. I work at community garden and also at Lago da Batata. And I have two questions. I would like to hear more from you about the phenomenon of arborophobia. I don't know if I didn't understand, but I would like to know why did that happen after World War II? And how did the society overcome this and started to love trees again? I'm very interested about this because I think we as a society, we have such a deep arborophobia. I don't know if people once loved trees in the cities, and I would know how to overcome this. And the second question is, I think it's a brilliant thing to think about the species of trees that are tolerant to soil deoxygenation. But I would like to know if you also use some techniques to improve soil so that you improve the conditions to tree survival.
So I'm really pleased, and thank you for the question about arborophobia, because I didn't think anyone would ask about that, and because it's one of my favourite topics. So, well, I think the phenomenon of arborophobia, fear of trees, that Robin Boyd, who was an architect, talked about, really highlights that need to do the cultural and social analysis of people's relationships with trees, because as Marcos indicated, there's no doubt the British were obsessed with trees in the 19th century. They, wherever they came, and other Europeans too, but I think the British were particularly... anyway, let's just accept my point there. That they... So the colonisers planted lots of trees. Everyone just accepted there would be parks and gardens and big avenues of trees. I think what happened in the 20th century in Australia was, in the southeast of the continent, was there was a kind of culture of neatness and order, a kind of limiting modernism, like a kind of imploded fear of anything too organic. And without getting too wild in my analysis here, but I feel very free now that I'm in Brazil. You can relate that to what we all now know about, you know, the autoimmune issues that children, you know, that children would. I mean, when I was a kid, we would eat dirt and do all that stuff and play outdoors. But, you know, after the Second World War, the increase of the fear of hygiene was very big. And we now say that, of course, with all this super hygiene in the West, we've had this build-up of autoimmune diseases. I don't want to check with the medical scientists here. Yeah. So I think that's part of it. There was just a kind of a creeping fear of nature developed. It's probably not a perfect analysis, but there's definitely something in it. Then what I think happened was that in Australia, certainly the native plant movement took off, meaning that there'd always been an interest in the Australian species. That's very true. But there was a general discovery in the gardening culture, remembering because we have these large private spaces, there's a very big industry that services people's interest in just planting gardens. And people wanted to plant more Australian plants, and suddenly, you know, when I was a little kid in the 70s, suddenly everyone was planting native eucalyptus. And suddenly, and they grow fast, right, as we all know. So suddenly these huge gum trees started to emerge in the city again. And I think people just went, oh, okay. Right? It was just a change. It was just this period where the suburbs were meant to be neat and trees were seen as big and dangerous. And yeah. So, but I think the native plant movement helped people get over their fear, take it back, in fact, to what had already occurred 50, 100 years before. And yeah, so your second question about soil is a good one. So I think the idea, I mean, very crudely, I think what we now try and emphasise is at least decompacting, so just ripping, depending on the type of area you're planting, whether it's a large park, a forest restoration project or a street, that you at least put air back into the soil, and where you can, that you add as much organic matter to the surface as possible in order to mulch the soil, and to provide the right sort of climate for soil microorganisms and to help ameliorate the soil that way. But it's very important, though, that you don't necessarily have the luxury of doing that restoration work before you plant. I mean, this is very topical at the moment at home, because the idea is that the presence of trees themselves will, over time, of course, ameliorate the soil as you get leaf litter accumulation. But so you still have that problem that you've got to select the species that will survive in the first place, because. Let's say because we have advanced trees. People plant large trees and they're very expensive. They might be $500-600 per tree, so you can't afford to have them die. If you're a council planting 1,000 trees a year or more, even though small trees often do better, there's just generally a policy of buying high quality trees that are already well established.
Can I just make a comment before you go about the arborophobia? I think this is really very complex stuff. I mean, this is cultural. Before Pasteur discovered microorganisms, people in Europe thought that the miasmas were the reason of disease, and they didn't want. And until now, I'm just coming back from Scandinavia. Even there, you find these big places that you have not a single tree, right? Because they were afraid of that. And once I asked also the guide in the Forbidden City in China, in Beijing, why the Forbidden City doesn't have any tree except for the garden there. And they said that they had no trees because the emperor was always afraid of being killed by somebody that would hide behind a tree. So this is spread everywhere. So you have cultural reasons, and you have also cultural reasons. For example, here in Brazil, you have these people from the northeast that come from a place where these people grew in a region where there are no trees. So trees are strange for them because they don't know what it is. So they are sort of maybe afraid of that. And there is the laziness that we have in São Paulo. We have laziness. People don't want the leaves of the trees to fall, and they have to work for that. It's just because they don't want to work for that. You have the business problem that is general. There are theses in the in Asia as well, many theses in Asia showing that the same problem that we have, people complaining about the name of the business being not seen because of the trees, and you have also I think one of the biggest problems is the botanical blindness that I wrote about, because people don't want to think about trees. Trees are not existent, are just part of the place that you have.
They're the wallpaper of
yes. So because they don't think about it, this is always behind and not a principal thing like we are starting to sell now.
And just quickly on that, I know.
Sorry, I lost the
no,
subject,
that's
why.
really interesting. It deserves. It is a complex issue, and for example, I think Sweden's interesting because certainly in Scotland, the higher the latitude, or the cooler and the more grey your summers, the more people will tend not to want to have large trees. Fair enough, because if you're living in Scotland and it's depressing and grey,
It's even darker,
right? Exactly. So in summer, you want to just be lying there getting as much solar radiation as possible, and that's literally why people don't want big trees in their streets. And maybe that's fair enough.
in the streets, but
In your gardens, even.
I did my PhD in Scotland. So once you go out of the city, I mean, you were almost out of the city. Then you have giant trees everywhere surrounding. The forests are kept, but they really are afraid of not having enough light, and this would be really a problem, a health problem, because people kill themselves because of that. The suicides increase because of that. So it's very much cultural and depends on the place, right? Well, I think we have to think here that we have to think about this problem taking a perspective from the tropical, because it's very characteristic. Giuliano couldn't be here, but we are starting to look at the other places and try to understand how people deal with trees in different places of the world. And if you go to the north, for example, the way of looking at trees is completely different from the tropical. So we have to have our own style, which is very similar to yours.
And I should say quickly that, I'm sure it's the same here. When you work for local government, municipal level is very close to the people, and it gets a little bit crazy, right? In terms of, management by complaint. And so the city of Melbourne that's produced all this good work, they have a lot of money compared to other councils in Melbourne, and they employ 3 full-time community engagement officers who've spent the last few years dealing just with this tree issue.
I was going to ask you this question. This is the second on the records of complaints in the city of São Paulo. This is second complaint.
So
is the same for you?
So it's constant. So, as I said, my brother works in this area in a wealthy area in Sydney, and he used to work in a working class area. And his stories, you could write a script for a comedy show, right? So you have to be realistic about that. People will complain about, it's covering the business sign, or, and fair enough, they're real complaints sometimes, but you're getting into a level of detail of people's phobias and loves and fears that is, would challenge any anthropologist, Adrian, I think.
Adrian, I think he raised his hand first.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a very quick point. I think Sergio was... Yeah. Oh, sorry, no, your neighbor there. Paulo, right. Paulo raised an interesting question about how the city of Melbourne can achieve this ambition, because it's a very ambitious goal, the 40% coverage, and a very expensive goal. And one of the interesting features of the policy is that 50% of this cost should be paid by the private sector. And so the way that the government of Melbourne Council wants to do that is they say if a bank or a private company wants to pay for half of the cost, then we, the council, will pay for the other half of the cost. So kind of public-private partnership. So they try to use this as a solution. And I thought this is interesting because just a couple of days ago, Professor Thais took us to a park here in Sao Paulo, and we saw the evidence of your mayor, João Doria's policy of putting Toyota and other big private companies into the parks to manage some of that space. And I wonder, in a way, it's a similar way to try to build some public-private partnership. But it's very challenging to do this in a way that's sensitive to local interests and that's not purely a market-oriented model. I think it's a real challenge that we face in Melbourne and in Sao Paulo as well. So, sorry, I just wanted to make
that's
a
a
short
good point.
comment.
I forgot all about that, Adrian. Thank you. But, yeah.
Behind that, why do you forget this exact number, 40%? Because you did a kind of math analysis and found the places where you can put.
Yeah, so it's a classic you know, what do you call it, target-oriented approach, meaning we do the analysis and then if essentially, you know, round up to a certain figure, then at least we have something to work towards. Nothing more scientific than that after the basic analysis is done. Yeah. I'm sorry it couldn't make it sound more sexy, but it's not.
Hi. Here.
Yeah.
I'm Luis from School of Medicine. Professor Chris, could you talk to us about the experience of Melbourne and planting trees on parking spaces on the streets where cars parks? Could you talk a little bit about it, if people like it or dislike it?
So you mean literally when the conflict between trees and people wanting to park their cars? Yeah. So so generally in some of the older parts of the city, so really built from the 1850s through to about 1900, this was during the period of great interest in planting trees. So there are big trees there, and as as cars came in the 20th century, they would literally, the trees would survive, but people would start parking over them or crash into them, and so that conflict emerged. And I think many trees were taken out after the Second World War because of this conflict. So the cars were given priority. But once a greater interest in environmental quality of life took off in the 60s and 70s, then efforts started to protect them. So now the trees that have survived and the new trees being put back in will have at least some kind of barrier to protect them, or they're trees that are you know, so tolerant of compaction that it's not so bad, it's not ideal that cars park over their root systems. But so the point is now that in those older areas of the city, they're the councils that have the biggest commitment to trees, and so the trees have, by and large, good protection. They're not going to be removed just because people want to park their cars. Does that answer your question?
What's particular in Melbourne, I think, because here in São Paulo we have a lot of problems with the size of the footsteps that are narrow, and they have to compete with the lights and the people and whatever. So in many places you are not allowed to put a tree because the footstep is too narrow. So the solution that we saw in Melbourne was that the trees were competing with the car in the same level of the car, you know. So between cars, where the cars would stop park, you have a space where you would put a tree. And this doesn't happen so far in São Paulo. I think you did once. You did already. Yes. And so that's what Luis asked you. Did you understand?
No. So what you need to understand from when you were staying in Melbourne is that sometimes that literally, even if the trees are new, there probably were trees there planted over 100 years ago, and the footpath has been pushed that way, right? Yeah, so that it's an ongoing tradition of, it's not it could be new in some areas, but mostly the trees have always been planted there. That's right. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Claudia. I work also in community gardens here and urban arborization.
I remember you, Claudia, from last year.
Okay, how do you at Melbourne achieve to put the canopy, not the number of trees planted, in the target of the municipality? Because here we have the number of trees, and we always get cheated because many of these trees are vandalized or murdered, and they survive only in the statistics of the municipality. For the municipality, all young tree planted is a tree. It's a successful case, but in reality it is not. So how do you change that mentality? Because what we need is that canopy, not number of individual trees, etc.
Absolutely, and the more, and your colleague who asked this question, the more I realise that in the city of Melbourne that 40% is a kind of rubbery figure, as we say. So now I'm thinking on the spot now. I think Dave Kendall, my colleague who has done a lot of that work for the City of Melbourne, I think the goal is to constantly measure just the success of it's essentially to measure the success of the planting. So you don't just tokenly count what's gone in the ground and say your job is done. You actually are and they do this, many councils. They do a quality assessment of the trees on an annual or biannual basis. So you are simply not abandoning the trees once they're planted. You are saying, yes, year 1, year 2, they're establishing, and eventually you would use ground truthing and just aerial or satellite imagery to analyse the extent to which the canopy has formed. But yeah, this I'm going to go home and say to the City of Melbourne, your 40% figure is confusing people. Why did you draw the line in the sand there? Anyway.
Hello, Chris. Thanks for the presentation. I'm Guilherme from Procan, Environmental Science post-graduation. And in São Paulo here, we have a lot of fruit trees in the city. And my questions about this, I don't know exactly why the municipality, thinking Portuguese and translating, how is in Melbourne, here in São Paulo, the municipality staff, I don't know if they are poorly capacitados, trained. They prune, they chop the trees, I think in a wrong way. How they do in Melbourne? Because here, falo em português. Vergonha em inglês. Aqui em São Paulo a gente tem muitas frutíferas, elas são podadas de forma bem errônea pela prefeitura. Eu acredito que porque o poder público não capacita direito os funcionários. Como que é essa capacitação na Austrália?
Yeah, sure, yeah. So this is where, but you mentioned fruit trees at the beginning of your...
I think Guilherme is worried because we have many fruit trees. If they prune it wrongly, you cannot collect these fruits, right? Yeah,
so,
you cannot fully enjoy these fruits.
The issue of, everyone understands pruning, obviously. That's basically chopping a plant. I think professional tree pruning, rather, requires training, especially for the big canopy trees, and literally a lot of tough young guys, jocks, right, want to become arborists in Melbourne because they can get a certain hero status and they can climb trees and swing around with chainsaws, but it's a hard life. But they have a lot of training about how to do the cuts properly, how to make sure the tree doesn't look disfigured. I wouldn't necessarily, even though they're very good, I wouldn't necessarily trust them with fruit trees, right? There's there's two slightly different issues. But still, I showed you some pictures where some very crude pruning had been done. So usually what happens is the professionally trained arborists who do know what they're doing, though, probably would be okay with a fruit tree. They're meant to do the pruning, but sometimes if the power companies decide that the tree is dangerous, they'll just come and do that work without any consultation, and you get something that just looks completely hideous and ruins the form of the tree. I think if we're going to have more edible tree species in our public landscapes, then we are going to need that extra level of training for their particular requirements. But, I mean, do you have many street trees that have edible fruit, or park trees?
We have lots of Myrtaceae family
fruits. Like this thing you've been feeding me, Thais.
Yeah. And I think...
It's the red stuff?
Yeah, the red one. What's it?
Pitanga or mora?
Pitanga, yeah.
They prune more than the necessary because this is small fruit trees, and they are pruning, I think it's for people do not picking. So
they're trying to stop people from...
Yeah, probably. I don't know exactly why. I was asking one of those guys of the staff, and they said, "Oh, here in São Paulo, have the orientation to not leave people to pick. We butchered. They
I don't know. I'm very interested in the history of people's relationships with plants and gardenings and these cultural issues. And do you have this term, or do you know this expression in English, weekend warrior? No. So it's a sort of a cliche, or not a cliche, a stereotype of a father in his back garden or the family's backyard on the weekend deciding as a recreational activity to go and start pruning things and to just get the tools and to just hack, right? And then to do this physical exertion and then feel good despite the disaster that you've just put it. So that's the weekend warrior. So I think if you don't have the technically trained staff who understand pruning, then you will get weekend warriors working during the week. It's as simple as that. They're just attacking. It's people just chop. That's what happens. Sorry, yeah.
More questions?
Wonder.
Hello. My name is Luciana. I'm from the School of Architecture, and I have two questions. The first one is I would like to ask you to comment a little bit more about the compensation process, the offset process. Because I don't know if I got it right, but the price you said people have to pay if they want to kill a tree, it's a little bit expensive. I think this is right, but here in São Paulo is very different. So how does it work, and how people do this process, how you define this price? And the second question is about it's a comment about the arborophobia. I don't know where I read this, but I read it somewhere that the idea of progress in Brazil is very related with a natural environment. So if a place is or if you city want to be related with progress, they don't want nature inside it, because natural environments are very related with progress places. So I don't know if agree with that, and if does it happen in Australia also?
So they're not related to nature.
Yeah, I mean, if the progress is related with unnatural environments. If you want to progress, you have to pave the streets, you have to do the sidewalks, and you have to pave all your backyard. If you put grass or just leave it without anything, it's progress. I don't know.
Pointed out. That's another part of the arborophobia. It's in São Paulo. I think we already have this in our brain, our reptile brain, but I think we lost. It's the correntão, right? Take the trees out and build the city. This is progress. And I heard now that in Manaus, for example, they have this very strong. They don't want the trees inside the city because they have that huge forest, and that represents lack of progress.
Wow. Oh, wow. Yeah. So, well, I mean, like I said, we have had there still is a kind of elements of arborophobia, but by and large, for example, our real estate industry is huge in Australia. We have very expensive housing now, sadly, amongst the most expensive in the world. And it is, generally speaking, what's happened as part of the change of arborophobia is that the very green areas are the ones that sell real estate at a premium price. And there's been research in North America on this too, that increasingly in Western cities, large trees, private trees, and nice gardens, so in the streets, in the parks, and in the private spaces, raises the real estate prices. And so we have this term leafy green suburbs, right? So a working class area of Melbourne has a street or a tree policy which they're calling leafy legacy. In other words, we are a poorer area, very multicultural, but we now want to become leafy and green like the wealthy parts of the city. So essentially, even if residents perhaps don't share those values, and that's another issue. Australia's a very multicultural country, and I was thinking of talking about that, but definitely different cultural groups have different attitudes to trees. But anyway, overall, if you think of the public policy stuff, and if you think too, there's also a very strong gardening culture, so that people, it's a very $2 billion a year industry just to sell plants to the general public for their own gardens. So there's just an inherent interest in planting trees, planting plants, gardening. But with the valuation method, there are two offset systems. One is for native vegetation. So if you're doing a big housing development and there's existing native trees, so this is a biodiversity-related policy, then there is an offset system that works on measuring the quality of that vegetation set against benchmarks of what the vegetation must have looked like in 1750, right? This gets very complicated. So you say, okay, this is a eucalyptus woodland, and we assess this now against the benchmarks of what it would have looked like pre-European. It comes out at 50%. Therefore, the developer must now, if they're going to clear some, they now have to raise the quality of the area that they're not destroying by adding different life forms, by getting rid of the weeds, etc., etc. That's a very complex system, which I used to work in this area, fraught with dangers in terms of low-level corruption, or at least not getting it right. But there have been examples where that's been done well, because the public, as Adrian was hinting at, the public sector struggles to manage our huge national park systems and to look after our biodiversity. So sometimes if you have private land that's going to be developed, if the developers, meaning the real estate developers, do provide the money, you can actually have an improvement to biodiversity because at least it's getting actual management money. With the individual trees, the Burnley valuation in the middle of the city, that really only applies to the damage done to an individual tree, and usually only to the corporations that can actually afford it. So you'll say, if they genuinely need to kill or destroy the tree, the system will look at the age of the tree, there's a visual assessment done to actually say, yes, is this, and a health assessment, is this a good quality tree? What would it cost to actually replace that tree at that size? And that could fall out at $100,000, $200,000. Then there's a genuine negotiation around that. Until then you get a negotiated price, but at least you set that price. But mostly what happens now is that you get these tree protection zones, and so most developers now don't want to pay. It's a disincentive system, so they don't want to pay that money, so they just put huge fences around these trees, and it really has improved. That system of having the pricing to disincentivize destruction has actually really had a big impact, because now you see a lot more protection on building sites of individual trees, and they generally survive.
I think we are about 10 minutes to go. Yeah. Let me just ask you a question. You mentioned biodiversity. Are you assessing biodiversity too? I mean, you have the number of trees, the price of trees, but do you have the price of the birds and the insects and the microorganisms?
So the habitat value is also assessed. Yeah, definitely. But
it's computed in the price of the tree?
If it's generally, it's like, just being specific to Melbourne, we have a species of eucalyptus, a river red gum. It has big hollows, which is important for birds and arboreal marsupials. And so it's generally just a question of if the age of the tree and the presence of hollows will be counted in.
Eu vou falar em português que eu me expresso melhor. Acho que a primeira coisa que eu queria falar é, para você entender um pouco do nosso desespero, seria legal uma visita na periferia, né? Para ver como é que funciona o crescimento da cidade. Assim, por exemplo, Parelheiros é onde ainda tem árvores incríveis, florestas incríveis, e a periferia simplesmente destrói para construir as casas e sem nenhum, ou praticamente nenhum controle ou planejamento da parte da prefeitura para que aquilo seja preservado ou não aconteça, né? Então, acho que parte do que a gente está discutindo, do medo e tal, na periferia isso fica muito nítido, que às vezes é simplesmente uma questão de espaço, né? Eles querem dominar ou criar mais espaço para as casas. E também talvez visitar algum tipo de favela ou a favela já mais construída, que é zero a presença de árvores, zero nenhuma. Então, só para entender um pouco do grau do nosso desespero, né?
So thank you, Nikki. Nikki and Sergio are responsible for this pocket forests we visited. They are co-responsible. We visit too this weekend. So Nikki is telling you that maybe you should visit the outskirts of the city. Translated already.
Oh, yeah,
okay.
sorry, I didn't well, I heard the name. How do you say it? The place we went to last year? Paralelos. So one thing that really impressed me, this is last year. Thais took me to visit some organic farms on the outskirts, and one thing I wanted to share was that we went to visit a permaculture farmer or organic farmer, and there was a beautiful patch of this remnant Atlantic rainforest on his property. Now, I used to work for a conservation organisation that specialised on biodiversity protection on private land, and I found this very moving because he said, I think, Guillermo, you said to him, this has these famous palms there, and you said these are very rare in Sao Paulo now, this type of rainforest, especially on private land. And he said, well, this is because in this area everyone was very motivated to clear this rainforest, any remnant patches, but my mother just happened to like it. Do you remember this story? And she just said to my father, I just want you to leave this area as it is. And I thought that was really interesting from the work I used to do, because it's usually very individual family circumstances that leave people to not decide to clear vegetation. But the south of the city seemed to have, it was very green, that area around.
So what Nikki said is, when you go there, you pass through large part of the city that are absolutely devoid of any green. And then there's a mounting pressure on. Big problem in São Paulo is the question, a place to live versus green areas, né? It's a very big conflict. Space, yes.
Entrando exatamente na pergunta, né? Eu acho que a política pública nossa, né, Brasil, acho que é nacional, né, ignora o crescimento na periferia, nas partes periféricas da cidade, né? Então a gente discute muito a arborização urbana da parte central, que tem uma certa vegetação, aqui onde a gente está e outros bairros, e a gente meio que ignora que nas beiradas da cidade ela está sendo completamente construída sem árvores, né? E aí a minha pergunta é, como, dentro desse contexto e outros problemas que a gente já abordou, como que é a estrutura pró-árvores, né? Como é que eles fazem o manejo das árvores urbanas da Austrália? Queria entender como é que é a estrutura do órgão, né? Então é uma prefeitura, é um cargo, alguém específico
vou só perguntar essa última parte, tá? What Nikki wants to know is how is the tree urban management in Melbourne? How does it constitute it? We have 2 minutes, but Marcus has to leave. If you want to, if we don't mind, yeah. How is it? No. How is it composed? How many people? What's the hierarchy? Which money comes from? Who does it? The urban management of trees in the city of Melbourne.
So the municipalities raise their funds locally from rates. So if you own property, you pay.
No, public.
Yeah, public. Okay. Yeah. So if you own property, you have to pay taxes to local government. Yeah. That pays for parks, gardens, trees, libraries, kindergartens, all those services. Yeah. These 29 or 30 local governments in Melbourne, so they're raising their own taxes to pay for all this. And despite what Adrian said about that one city of Melbourne, the rest of the councils don't, the money to manage all the green space and the trees is from ratepayers, from property owners. And then they also get money from the state government, but also from federal programs which they have to apply for. So the core budgets come from local taxes raised.
And how is it, for instance, in each council you have how many people, or what's the hierarchy, or is it local?
Hierarchy, yeah.
Hierarchy.
Yeah, so it's local councils elected. So councils are locally elected.
And who, in the local councils, how is this mounted? How does it work? How the practical work is done?
Yeah, so generally speaking, you have parks and gardens teams. Some of them are still managed by engineers, but most have horticultural or landscape architects, or some park professional, some landscape professional who manages the strategic level, the policy level, but also the people wearing the high vis, the operations, the depot, the trucks, the chainsaws, the whole lot. Often they use contractors, but it's generally a specialised landscape department. So they're called Parks and Gardens Department or Public Realm, or, yeah? So they might, yes, there are lots of landscape businesses that often get contracts with these councils. So, for example, some councils will use their own in-house teams of arborists to manage the pruning and the actual health of the trees, but many will also use contractors as well. So it's a big industry, yeah.
Okay.
Posso fazer uma última pergunta? Bem rápida. Como é que ele vê o plantio feito pelo munícipe?
How do you see the plant, the dweller, how say this? The city dweller planting trees. What's your idea about this community work, like we showed you in the city?
Yeah. So what do I think of it here? I thought it was really good, what I saw. I like it. It was interesting because for me, what I saw of your projects was it was like ecological restoration right in the middle of the city. Is that how you see it as the designers? Is that it's using local species, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have large areas of most councils now in Melbourne, most municipalities have programs where they do that work. So in other words, they divide this work into... We have a term in Australia, a sort of cultural term for our natural vegetation called the bush. Have you heard of this, Ryan? Oh, okay, you have the same. Yeah, so we have bushland crews. So you have, of that budget that I just talked about, that money, even the most urbanised, degraded areas, if you want to use that term, will have the staff who specialise just in the trees, in the streets, the staff who specialise in managing the parks generally, and then you'll have the specialist crews that only work to restore the local indigenous vegetation. So they have their own nurseries, their own form of training, of which I do some. And some councils it's all mixed together, but some will say, you're the bush crew, you do the indigenous restoration, you do the parks, you do the streets, and so on and so forth. But you do the because sport is huge. So you do the cricket pitches and the football grounds, right? Yes.
What would you say is the share between government action and municipal?
Right. So municipal. Yeah. So grassroots activity. Yeah. So the effort. Yeah. So this bushland management has become very mainstream. So most councils will invest in restoring indigenous vegetation, but that was a grassroots movement that started it. So starting 30 years ago, maybe 35 years ago, you had community groups saying we want to bring back some of the vegetation that has been destroyed by European settlement, and they started to do the work on their own, and then it became much more mainstream, and eventually at the local political level they started to say let's now manage this with the community, but actually give it some investment from government. So that's become a very normal part of urban green space in Melbourne, the indigenous planting.
We have to finish officially. I think if someone still wants to make any comment, that will be... do you have to go, Marcus, already? So So, can stay? Yeah. Okay, we are here. So we thank you, Marcus, very, very much for your presence here. And okay, and we can go further. Okay. We have the space. Thank you, Marcus. Gabriel.
Yes, I have one. You try to explain in English my point of view. I think I'd like you to comment. How do you guys got this conscious? Like, how important is the nature between us humans? Because you guys, I've been to Australia, and I see you guys very ahead in this type of environmental education and those stuffs. How to deal with that, even in a public, how you say, way, like through the laws and things like that. I see that things works very well in Australia. I mean, comparing to Brazil, right? So I'm gonna get to Brazil soon. So I'd like you to comment how you guys build up this public, political, and structure, all right? And I would you like to comment a bit what Nick said, because I had this type of view also. I see we humans create the gardens to get this connection with the nature. That's why we have gardens. Yeah. It's very long ago. It's not nothing new. But here in Brazil, particularly, if you go, I don't know if you have a chance to go to Pedra da Cantareira or Pico do Araguá.
I thought of taking them there, but it's
because
closed.
you can have a big perspective from what's São Paulo. We're basically surrounded by we're in the Vale, and we're surrounded by nature, very tropical nature, and but you can still see people occupied the mountains, like favelas, with no nature between them, like Nick said. I see that because they are fighting for a piece of land, not for the nature. And that's a big issue here, actually, in São Paulo. Maybe I think beginning of the year, the new mayor, he opened a public audience to people to comment what they need, what they want to São Paulo, how they want to see the city, and then I see a nice combat there. I can say like that. Between the people, mainly people from here, Zona Oeste, the east part of São Paulo, wanted to protect the green of São Paulo, and on the other side, the people want a place to live. So it's a big contrast. Like things that you guys don't have there, right? No. And I'd like you to comment, because I think what we need here is how to deal with this public situation. I have this conscious, like the nature is important, how we can make a nice path to deal with that, considering the situations like we have in favelas.
So we don't have that situation in Australia where, there are people who are desperate for places to live, trying to move into or occupy natural areas. And we have this kind of, and this applies anywhere in the world really now, in any new world countries like Brazil, like Australia, like United States, so-called new world, where because we have this legacy of our really fantastic national park system in Australia, so large amounts of protected areas. But in the last 30 years, we've had to, reflect and change our thinking about those national parks. Instead of thinking of them as pristine places of pure nature that we discovered, right, as Europeans, as settlers, these were obviously places occupied by indigenous people for thousands of years. I know this is a slightly different issue from what you raised, but it's a sobering thought to think that if you are part of a very positive culture towards nature, that you go camping in a national park or hiking, and that this place is only empty and natural because the original inhabitants were killed or moved. You know, it's not to become a bleeding heart, as we say, you know, but that has become a real issue in Australia, and to have co-management of national parks with Indigenous people, and I'm sure that happens here. So that was really a commentary on just the idea of pure nature anyway. That most landscapes, increasingly, I suppose, not just as a professional, but as a public, trying to get people to think that these natural areas were actually cultural landscapes originally. They were maintained and managed by people. So, so that's a slightly changing view of what nature is anyway.
Is that a British heritage? I mean,
yeah, I think it's well, I guess there is a kind of British a legacy of a sort of a European view of nature, a romantic view, but then to give credit to the conservation movement, I mean, really in the late 60s, early 70s in Australia was a very pivotal period where the development movement was powerful, and you destroy everything, clear for agriculture, destroy built heritage, and they were doing very well. And so then there was an alliance between labour unions and actually very middle class people to really push the conservation movement, and it kind of worked. So you know, where I come from in Victoria, there was a large area of native vegetation, of bushland, of biodiversity that was going to be developed for farmland, and it was really an alliance between concerned city people in Melbourne, largely educated, and actually bureaucrats who were saying, well, if we make these farms, the farmers there's going to be droughts, they're going to be poor, we're going to have to subsidise them, why not just leave it as wilderness? So this is really how the conservation movement took off. So I think there was just a huge grassroots effort to start thinking about heritage and to just stop, just to say that we should preserve areas. And then increasingly now that we have a bigger global view of the idea of the functional view of ecosystems, which is still, you could argue, a neoliberal view of nature, right? That it has to have this function in order to survive. But still, that has, I think, started to make the conservation ethic in Australia seem to be something that is, you know, this idea of natural capital. If we don't have these areas, we're doomed anyway. So, but you're right. I think the overall mindset in Australia, there's always conflicts, but that a foundation of well-preserved natural areas is important. But also because of the decreasing budgets for government services, we do now have also a very strong private conservation movement that is actually buying land. So there are organisations that are saying, well, the government's not doing enough, and so they're actually going out and buying large areas of land to turn them into nature reserves. Yeah, but I don't. It's really difficult for me to comment on the idea of actual habitation conflicts with natural areas. That's something that's way outside my experience. But I mean, then you start asking questions about the government's role in investing in public housing, I assume, and huge questions about how this all works. So, yeah.
It's complex. Just a last question. Do you guys learned anything with the Aboriginals in Australia, like how to conserve? Because they were, as my view, as the natives here in Brazil, they were very conservative about the nature.
Yeah, so
I mean, the most
it's changing.
Conservative.
Literally every year it changes more, that understanding. So look, to put it really simply, what we've worked out is we had this huge movement to create national parks, starting really, it's very old in Australia, but really not really taking off until the 60s and 70s. And the idea was, it's just nature, you just put a fence around it and the job is done, right? Then becomes the awareness, actually, Aboriginal people used to live here, right? And now what's really starting, and genuinely is part of programs, is saying they didn't... Because the view in Australia was just sort of Aboriginal people kind of floated around as mystical nature beings, right? And of course, it's an extremely insulting view of people, right? So now we understand that the detailed level of management by Indigenous people in terms of the use of fire, but actually effectively cultivating crops, means that we are now trying to re-establish with Aboriginal people the way they used to manage country, as we call it. So managing country, especially with fire. Because we've changed the ecosystems, even the ones that were relatively pristine, have been modified radically by not having Aboriginal management.
Okay. Anyone? Yes.
Eu, na verdade, gostaria de aproveitar o espaço para dar um informe que nesta quinta-feira à noite né, vai estar acontecendo uma palestra na Fundação SOS Mata Atlântica para discutir a arborização aqui na cidade de São Paulo. A palestrante é a Priscila, que está aqui presente. Quem está promovendo o evento é a Rede Nossa São Paulo. Às 19h30, a fundação fica na Avenida Paulista, no Conjunto Nacional. É só aparecer os interessados, o espaço está aberto.
Convite
quinta-feira agora à noite, 19h30. Dia 9, nessa quinta-feira.
Obrigado pelo convite. Vamos todos ir. And he's saying that this week on the 9th there will be a talk on urban urbanization in São Paulo, performed by this lady, and everybody is welcome. Do you want to make any questions or any doubts? You?
Esse plano que foi elaborado lá em Melbourne, gostaria de saber quem participou na elaboração, se teve participação popular, né? Quanto tempo demorou para ser feito, e eu vi que ele dura até 2032, né? Se nesse prazo tá previsto alguma modificação posterior, né?
You talk about this Melbourne plan or urban forest. She wants to know who did it, if there was any popular participation of the communities, and if there's room for changes, for improvements in this plan until 2030s. Yeah.
So no, that's a really good question. So the City of Melbourne, that central area, employed and then our permanent staff community engagement officers to facilitate a very elaborate community consultation program. One of the things they wanted to do was, sure, as professionals, they already had their ideas about where the trees should be and the famous 40% target. But they wanted to make sure that different members of the community had their chance to argue and debate about these issues, because you get some very conservative views about certain types of trees, and other people want to do more radical stuff, and so the community engagement officers literally set up workshops across that municipality to get people to start. I can't remember the name. They use a special methodology of community engagement which effectively gets the community to do your work for you, I think. That's where they actually end up, you see these pictures of people planning for you. It's amazing. And people who actually have very different points of view, almost like a mediation system that leads to people working together. So the answer is yes. They're the only city in a municipality in Melbourne that can afford to do something at that level, but it's certainly a model for the other ones to aspire to now. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. Yeah. What kind of technology do you use?
What kind of technology do you use to measure the canopy inside the urban agroflorist?
Yeah. No. In all honesty, other than just simply assessing from, satellite imagery or aerial imagery.
Measuring.
Yeah, actually, I do have first-hand experience. One of these arborists who he's using a drone now, you're right, was terrorising me with one of his drones recently. So, because he came to our Burnley Gardens to test his drone. So, I think there's a clip of me on YouTube looking terrified, which I don't. So, yeah, because it's not my specialty area, I haven't been involved, but they certainly are using drones now, you're right. And that's partly just, it's partly just even doing individual tree assessment, so you don't have to climb the tree. You can actually be watching the tree.
And do you have any other technology to measure the components of the tree, like using an IoT, Internet of Things, to inside the tree, outside?
Yeah. So I have a colleague, Denise Johnson, who uses some kind of machine that goes bing. That's all I'm going to say. No, I just don't. I don't know what it's called. It's maybe that thing, but yes, these people exist, and that's how they diagnose. No, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that tree assessment is truly quantified and based on real. It's not just. For example, the work my brother does is based on informed qualitative assessment of a tree. So he might identify an individual disease, but it's really still that, just looking at the tree, but it's not actually putting a tool in to say, okay, I think particularly the presence of fungi is a big issue. I don't know, I'm not an expert in this area, but certainly the issue of having better diagnostic tools to do tree assessment is a big thing that people are looking at, yeah. Yep.
Gabriel.
Talk about education. How do you guys pass this to society? Like what you guys doing? Do you have any educational program, or how you guys deal with that? Just do that, and I'm gonna do that, and the people is gonna observe that, or you?
So is this more in terms of the community education, or just the actual work itself? Like
how you do show to the people, how you communicate to the population the work you're doing, in meaning that this would lead to
preserve,
education.
to be part of, to help to, you know.
So, this is an interesting point if I've got the question right, because a lot of these councils, these municipalities don't do it very well. They decide they want to put in certain types of trees, and they have problems, so they put them in. The trees might get vandalised. They get all the people with the phone calls and the emails, and they're dealing with it at a very ad hoc way, dealing with the community education process. Some councils are much better at making people aware of these bigger issues, like dealing with long-term effects of climate change, or just the amenity value, as we would say, just improving the quality of our neighbourhoods. And so they put more effort into community engagement. So there's a spectrum from the City of Melbourne, which is very... So, for example, the City of Melbourne had and you can look this up online, I think if you look up email a tree, right, have you seen this? So I think originally their idea was that they wanted to know if people liked particular trees. And people started writing personal messages to the trees. And it was very successful. And there are certain trees I know in the city of Melbourne itself that I love too. And people write these really, dear golden elm. Every day I drive to work and I'm stuck in the traffic and I hate my life, and then I see you, and I feel much better. But again, that's the.
And the tree answers. Eh?
Oh, that's right. The tree answers. It does. Yeah. So that's very successful, but a lot of areas it's pretty, as we would say, shambolic. I mean, it's like because the other thing is too that just in terms of the streets, these so-called nature strips are in fact, I have a colleague doing a whole PhD on the history of these strange verges, right, as a sort of public-private interface, because they are strictly speaking public land, but individual residences, private citizens, are responsible for maintaining them, and yet they're not allowed to choose what tree they put there. So they're a classic, exactly. So you often have people saying, I want to plant, I don't like the tree you've planted, or I want to plant a lemon tree, or I don't want any trees at all. And so, I have a colleague who was an arborist, tree professional, dealing with these kind of complaints, and he kind of had a nervous breakdown. He's okay now, that's why I'm laughing. Because it's just too much, so it's something you need to manage it. It's not so bad in parks. I mean, generally speaking, you decide to put in a big tree planting program. The community might help you plant those trees, or they'll be more accepting. But wherever there's that feeling of the community that the tree choice by the government is not what they like, that needs to be managed. You know, people need to be brought along with you. Yeah. Yeah. Was it? I can't remember what your question was.
Education. You answered.
So
you answered.
the answer,
that some do
yeah,
well, the better, others do.
Yeah,
not so
there's
well.
really good ways of doing it, and then there's very sloppy ways of doing it. Yeah.
Any more questions? No? So thank you very much for coming here. Thank you, Chris, so much. I think it's no doubt that everybody appreciated it. And thank you guys for coming. Obrigada, viu?
Gente, só um aviso. Quem não assinou a lista, por favor, assina, porque se precisar de certificado depois não tem como verificar se veio ou não.